Another year means another Final Fantasy VII release. But this year, we're getting a built-from-scratch remake instead of another remaster, like so many ports that have graced consoles, PCs, tablets, and phones over the past 2 decades. While this might seem like a clever way to jam one of the most successful video game properties down our throat again, right now is actually the perfect time to revisit the themes and concerns introduced to us in 1997 when we first met Cloud, Aerith, and the sexy, stabby Sephiroth. This is The Breakdown. Final Fantasy VII gets a lot of credit for introducing Japanese role-playing games to a Western audience. Sony lobbied hard to lure Square away from Nintendo, then put a massive marketing effort behind the title's international release, and it worked.
A story of a love that can never be, and a hatred that always was. And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
In North America, over 1 million copies of the game sold within its first 2 months, a huge accomplishment for a relatively unproven genre in the late 90s. Excluding the aforementioned re-releases, the game sold just under 10 million copies during its initial run on the PlayStation. This may seem small compared to today's numbers, but it was huge for the time. With groundbreaking graphics, a stunning score, and delightful gameplay, Final Fantasy VII set the standard for future role-playing games. Characters like Cloud Strife, Tifa Lockhart, Barrett Wallace, Red 13, Vincent Valentine, and everyone's favorite Mako-eyed bad boy Sephiroth immediately became popular, making cameos and appearances in subsequent games, including their own properties, and an eventual direct-to-DVD movie, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. But all of this is icing. The real substance comes from Final Fantasy VII's incredible narrative. The game starts with Sad Boy Cloud and his ridiculously giant sword aiding Barrett, I've got a gun for an arm, Wallace, in the destruction of a Mako reactor, one of the several ominous energy plants looming over the neo-metropolis of Midgar. The world of Final Fantasy VII is already in the early stages of a global crisis event caused by Shinra Electric Power Company, a megacorporation that also serves as Midgar's authoritarian government. In order to both provide for the people and maintain its grip on the world, Shinra harvests massive quantities of Mako from the world's core, sapping the planet of its lifeblood in order to transform Mako energy into electricity. What follows is a battle over the fate of the planet between a group of freedom fighters branded as eco-terrorists and a government that values profits over life. Sure, there's the whole crisis of identity that makes up the majority of the plot as Cloud learns he's the failed clone of an alien-infused super soldier megalomaniac, and also something about a magical meteor plummeting from the heavens, but let's focus on the existential threats we can relate to. Back in 1997, environmental movements and the climate crisis were just beginning to emerge in the public eye.
If you're not recycling, you're throwing it all away.
The United Nations was working on the Kyoto Protocol, and that year's El Niño gave America a hint of the devastation possible by severe weather events. The Kyoto Protocol aimed to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2010, but after heavy lobbying efforts from energy executives, the United States became the only signatory who refuses to ratify in the treaty, citing concerns for the U.S. economy. So, it was a bit of a surprise that Final Fantasy VII, which had been in development for a few years by that point, had such awareness of the role of both government and corporate interests in environmental outcomes. Producer Hironobu Sakaguchi initially envisioned the story taking place in New York City in 1999. Midgar, which would eventually serve as a replacement for the Big Apple, was a dramatic change in setting for the franchise, representing a more modern and technological shift compared to the traditional medieval worlds of previous games. And it was the right choice. The dark and grungy streets of Midgar are a stark visual contrast with the rest of the game's world, which becomes greener and more vibrant the farther the characters travel from the starting city. Midgar is a multifaceted symbol within the game, representing the health of the planet along with the health of society. Unfortunately for its residents, Midgar also represents the social inequalities created by economic divide. In this city, the wealthiest 1% live on a platform disc that hovers over the rest of the city, and in typical Mr. Burns fashion, it literally blocks out the sun for the rest of the population. Deprived of light, the majority of Midgar now relies on Shinra for all of its energy needs. As our characters romp through the slums of Midgar's Undercity, they witness not only poverty, but organized crime, corruption, and human trafficking, all consequences of the class system reinforced by Shinra's lust for power. While most of the citizens of Midgar seem to dislike Shinra, they're too reliant on the infrastructure provided by the conglomerate to fight back. The city's also plagued by apathy, which is propagated by the Shinra-owned news agencies, which have no problem disseminating misinformation to preserve the status quo. Game writers Kazushika Nojima and Yoshinori Kitase and producer Sakaguchi were clearly concerned about unchecked power, and weren't afraid to point out how government can serve as a willing collaborator in injustice, exploitation, and economic disparity. Corruption, distrust, and dissatisfaction with government are major themes throughout this story. With the evil Shinra taking extraordinary steps, like running alien-infused soldier programs to maintain their power. At one point in the plot, Shinra drops a portion of Upper Midgar onto the city, crushing a section of civilians living underneath. Because of their ability to control the dissemination of information on news broadcasts, Shinra is able to place blame on our protagonist, creating a false flag scenario. Concerns about the environment, corrupt government, corporate greed, and social injustice weren't exactly new in 1997, but it was uncommon to see these themes in a video game. As time has progressed, the themes of rapacious capitalism, authoritarianism, and environmental collapse found in Final Fantasy VII have become more familiar, with the consequences becoming more present in our world. Deadly weather systems have only increased in frequency since Final Fantasy VII's release. Record-breaking heatwaves in Europe, droughts throughout America, hellish infernos in Australia, and devastating hurricanes, cyclones, and tropical storms are becoming the new normal. The severity of these disasters, including the radical fluctuation of extreme weather events, has been directly tied to carbon emissions and greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere by fossil fuels. Final Fantasy VII predicted that climate and economics would be directly connected, with the harsh consequences disproportionately affecting those living in poverty. The game also saw how a powerful government would have the ability to set and influence the narrative around climate change. Shinra is not a state-owned company, it's a for-profit organization that eventually becomes strong enough to infiltrate and overtake the government. Spoiler, that's a terrible thing. Art has the distinct advantage of being able to show us truths about reality in an imaginary setting. The fictional reality of Final Fantasy VII predicts a world in which corporations and governments are indistinguishable from each other, where monopolistic and authoritarian efforts are actively killing the planet and oppressing citizens to accumulate power. Good art survives the test of time because it teaches us the consequences of our decisions. 23 years later, the themes present in Final Fantasy VII are not only very real, but some of them are actually manifesting in our world, which is why this remake and its eventual spin-offs is just as important today as it was in 1997. So there you go. We went the whole video without talking about Sephiroth stabbing.
Wow!
Sorry. What else do you guys remember from the 90s that predicted where we'd be now in 2020? Besides The Simpsons, obviously. Leave your ideas in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that bell, pack a snack. We'll see you next time. This is The Breakdown.